The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Private James Morrison adjusted his red tunic for what he thought would be another routine day of ceremonial duty. At 22 years old, Morrison had spent 3 years serving in the Queen's Guard, a position that filled him with immense pride and responsibility. His family back in Yorkshire had celebrated when he received the honor, knowing that only the most disciplined soldiers were selected for this prestigious role. Morrison stood at attention outside the palace gates, his bearskin hat perfectly positioned, his rifle held with military precision. Tourists gathered around, snapping photographs of the stoic guards who had become symbols of British tradition and discipline. For Morrison, this wasn't just a job. It was a sacred duty to protect the crown and uphold centuries of military tradition. The trouble began when Morrison noticed a well-dressed man in his 50s repeatedly trying to engage him in conversation. The man, who appeared to be a wealthy businessman based on his expensive suit and confident demeanor, seemed to take pleasure in testing the guard's resolve to remain motionless and silent. What started as innocent tourist curiosity quickly escalated into something more sinister. "I bet you can't stay quiet if I offer you money," the man whispered, pulling out a thick wallet. "Come on, soldier boy. Everyone has a price." Morrison's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure, staring straight ahead as he had been trained. The man's attempts grew bolder, moving closer and making increasingly inappropriate comments. Other tourists began to notice the uncomfortable situation, but the man seemed emboldened by the attention. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" the man taunted, now standing directly in front of Morrison. "I suppose they train you boys to be nothing more than living statues. How pathetic." The breaking point came when the man made a crude comment about the Queen herself, questioning her worth and making disparaging remarks about the monarchy. Morrison's face flushed red beneath his bearskin hat. His grandfather had served in World War II, fighting for king and country, and his father had been a career military man who instilled in him a deep respect for the crown. Without warning, Morrison broke protocol. He stepped forward, his usually steady voice shaking with controlled anger. "Sir, you will show respect for Her Majesty and this institution, or you will leave immediately." The man's eyes lit up with triumph. "Ah, so the toy soldier can speak after all. This is rich. Wait until I tell my friends about this." Morrison realized his mistake immediately, but it was too late. The man had pulled out his phone and was recording the exchange. Within moments, the situation spiraled completely out of control. The man began shouting, claiming that the guard had threatened him and demanding to speak to someone in charge. Palace security officers quickly arrived on the scene, trying to de-escalate the situation. The man, whose name was revealed to be Richard Blackwood, claimed he was a prominent businessman with connections to government officials. He demanded that action be taken against Morrison, threatening to make the incident public and embarrass the entire Guard regiment. Within the hour, Morrison found himself facing his commanding officer, Captain Sarah Williams. The captain was known for her fair but strict approach to military discipline, and Morrison could see the disappointment in her eyes as she reviewed the incident report. "Private Morrison," she began, her voice measured but firm, "you understand the gravity of what occurred today. The Queen's Guard maintains their discipline and composure under all circumstances. This is not merely tradition. It is the foundation of our duty." Morrison stood at attention, his earlier pride now replaced with crushing shame. "Yes, ma'am. I have no excuse for my actions." The situation grew worse when Richard Blackwood's lawyer arrived, threatening legal action for what he claimed was assault and intimidation by a member of the military. Though Morrison had done nothing more than speak sternly, Blackwood was painting the incident as a serious breach of protocol that could damage the reputation of the entire Guard. As news of the incident began to spread through military channels, Morrison learned that Blackwood had significant political connections and was using his influence to ensure the matter would not be quietly resolved. Phone calls were being made to government offices, and pressure was mounting for Morrison to face serious consequences. By evening, Morrison found himself in military police custody, charged with conduct unbecoming of a member of the Queen's Guard. The handcuffs felt cold and heavy around his wrists as he was led away from the palace he had sworn to protect. His fellow guards watched in silence, knowing that any one of them could have found themselves in the same situation given the right provocation. The holding cell was small and sterile, a stark contrast to the grandeur of the palace he had left behind. Morrison sat on the narrow bench, replaying the day's events in his mind. He had let his emotions override his training. And now, he was facing the possibility of court-martial, dismissal from the service, and the destruction of his military career. As night fell, Morrison wondered if anyone would speak up for him. He had no idea that his case had already reached the attention of someone who understood exactly what it meant to serve with honor and face impossible situations. Colonel Marcus Whitfield, a decorated veteran with 30 years of military service, had heard about the incident through military channels. Colonel Whitfield was known throughout the armed forces as a man who never forgot what it meant to be a soldier on the ground. Despite his high rank and numerous commendations, he remembered his own early days in service and the challenges young soldiers faced. When he learned about Morrison's situation, something stirred in his memory, a similar incident from his own past that had taught him valuable lessons about justice and standing up for what was right. The colonel had been reviewing Morrison's service record when the news arrived. The young guard had an exemplary military history, with commendations for dedication and professionalism. This single incident seemed completely out of character, which made Whitfield suspicious about the true nature of what had occurred. Meanwhile, Morrison spent a sleepless night in custody, knowing that tomorrow would likely bring his military career to an end. He thought about his family, his grandfather's war medals, and the pride he had felt wearing the Queen's uniform. All of it seemed to be slipping away because of one moment of human emotion in the face of deliberate provocation. What Morrison didn't know was that Colonel Whitfield was already making inquiries about Richard Blackwood, and what he was discovering would change everything. The colonel's investigation was revealing a pattern of behavior that suggested Morrison had been deliberately targeted by someone with a history of provoking military personnel for his own amusement and profit. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of military justice and reveal the true character of everyone involved. Colonel Marcus Whitfield arrived at his office before dawn, his mind focused on the case of Private Morrison. With 3 decades of military service behind him, Whitfield had seen young soldiers destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. And something about this case troubled him deeply. He had requested all available files on both Morrison and Richard Blackwood, and what he found in those documents would fuel his determination to uncover the truth. Morrison's military record painted the picture of an exemplary soldier. He had completed his basic training at the top of his class, received commendations for his conduct during ceremonial duties, and had never faced disciplinary action of any kind. His commanding officers consistently rated him as professional, reliable, and deeply committed to his duties. This single incident stood out like a glaring anomaly in an otherwise spotless career. Richard Blackwood's file, however, told a very different story. Through his military contacts and a few discreet inquiries, Whitfield discovered that Blackwood had a disturbing pattern of targeting military personnel. Over the past 5 years, there had been at least 4 similar incidents where Blackwood had provoked soldiers on duty, then claimed mistreatment when they responded to his deliberate antagonism. Each time, Blackwood had used his considerable wealth and political connections to ensure maximum consequences for the soldiers involved. 2 had been dismissed from service entirely. 1 had faced court-martial, and another had been demoted and reassigned to a remote posting. In each case, Blackwood had claimed compensation for emotional distress and alleged assault, despite the fact that no soldier had ever laid a hand on him. The colonel's investigation revealed that Blackwood owned a private security company that specialized in recruiting former military personnel. His method was cynical and calculated. He would target promising young soldiers, provoke them into breaking protocol, then offer them employment with his company after their military careers were destroyed. It was a twisted form of recruitment that left dedicated soldiers stripped of their honor and desperate for work. Whitfield's anger grew as he read through witness statements from Blackwood's previous incidents. The man was a predator who fed on the discipline and honor that made good soldiers vulnerable to his manipulations. He knew that dedicated military personnel would not strike back physically, but he also understood that everyone had a breaking point when faced with sufficient provocation and disrespect. Armed with this information, Colonel Whitfield decided to pay a visit to Private Morrison in military detention. He found the young guard sitting in his cell, still wearing his dress uniform but stripped of his ceremonial sword and other symbols of his position. Morrison's eyes showed the strain of a sleepless night and the weight of knowing his career was likely over. "Private Morrison," the colonel said as he entered the cell. "I'm Colonel Whitfield. I've been reviewing your case." Morrison immediately stood at attention, despite his circumstances. "Sir, I have no excuse for my conduct yesterday. I failed to maintain the discipline expected of the Queen's Guard." Whitfield studied the young man carefully. "Tell me exactly what happened, Private. Every detail, no matter how small." Over the next hour, Morrison recounted the entire incident, from Blackwood's initial attempts at conversation to the final moment when he broke protocol to defend the honor of the crown. The colonel listened intently, asking specific questions about Blackwood's behavior and the exact words that had been spoken. "Private, did Mr. Blackwood record your interaction with his phone?" Whitfield asked. "Yes, sir. He started recording as soon as I spoke to him. He seemed pleased that I had responded." This detail confirmed Whitfield's suspicions. Blackwood had been deliberately creating evidence of the soldiers' responses to his provocations, using their own sense of honor against them. The colonel excused himself and immediately began making phone calls to contacts throughout the military and government. Meanwhile, Richard Blackwood was meeting with his lawyer, confident that this latest incident would result in both compensation and another potential recruit for his security company. He had already leaked details of the story to friendly journalists, painting himself as an innocent civilian who had been intimidated by an out-of-control soldier. "This is perfect," Blackwood told his lawyer. "The public loves stories about military misconduct. We'll demand a formal apology, compensation for emotional trauma, and the soldier's dismissal. Then, in a few months, I'll approach him about joining our company. These military types are always grateful for a second chance." What Blackwood didn't know was that Colonel Whitfield had spent the morning speaking with the previous soldiers who had fallen victim to his scheme. One by one, Whitfield tracked down the men whose careers had been destroyed and convinced them to share their stories. The pattern became undeniable. Blackwood was systematically targeting and destroying military careers for his own profit. By afternoon, Whitfield had assembled a comprehensive file detailing Blackwood's predatory behavior. He also discovered something even more damaging: security footage from previous incidents that Blackwood's lawyers had suppressed, showing the deliberate and aggressive nature of his provocations. The colonel's next stop was the office of General Patricia Hawthorne, the commanding officer responsible for all ceremonial guards. General Hawthorne was known as a tough but fair leader who valued the traditions and honor of the military above all else. Whitfield presented his findings to her, laying out the evidence of Blackwood's systematic targeting of military personnel. "This man is a parasite," Whitfield told the general. "He's been using our own values against us, destroying good soldiers to feed his business interests. Private Morrison isn't the first, and he won't be the last unless we take action." General Hawthorne reviewed the evidence with growing outrage. "How many soldiers has this man destroyed?" "At least 4 that I've confirmed, probably more. Each one was a dedicated serviceman with an exemplary record, just like Morrison. Blackwood specifically targets soldiers in high-profile positions where any incident will receive maximum attention." The general's expression hardened. "What do you recommend, Colonel?" "We turn the tables on him," Whitfield replied. "Tomorrow, there's going to be a disciplinary hearing for Private Morrison. Blackwood will be there to testify, expecting to see another soldier's career destroyed. Instead, we're going to expose him for what he really is." That evening, Colonel Whitfield visited Morrison again, this time with a different purpose. "Private, tomorrow's hearing is going to be unlike anything you're expecting. I need you to trust me and follow my lead, no matter what happens. Can you do that?" Morrison looked confused but nodded. "Yes, sir." "May I ask what you've discovered?" "You're not the first soldier Blackwood has targeted, and you were never meant to be the last. This man has made a career out of destroying military careers, but tomorrow, that ends." As the colonel left the detention facility, he reflected on his own early career and the mentors who had protected him from similar predators. The military was supposed to be a brotherhood that looked after its own, and he was determined to ensure that tradition continued. The next morning would bring a confrontation that would expose the truth about Richard Blackwood and potentially save not just Morrison's career, but the careers of future soldiers who might fall victim to his schemes. Colonel Whitfield spent the night preparing for what he knew would be the most important hearing of his career. Not because it would affect his own future, but because it would determine whether justice could still prevail in a system that sometimes seems stacked against the honest and honorable. The military tribunal room was packed with officers, legal representatives, and witnesses as Private Morrison's disciplinary hearing began. Morrison sat in his dress uniform, clean-shaven, and maintaining military bearing despite the gravity of his situation. Across the room, Richard Blackwood sat confidently beside his expensive lawyer, occasionally smirking as if the outcome was already decided in his favor. General Patricia Hawthorne presided over the tribunal, flanked by 2 other senior officers who would help determine Morrison's fate. The charges were read aloud. Conduct unbecoming of a member of the Queen's Guard, breaking protocol while on ceremonial duty, and intimidating a civilian. Each charge carried serious consequences that could end Morrison's military career permanently. Blackwood's lawyer presented their case first, painting a picture of an out-of-control soldier who had threatened and intimidated an innocent tourist. Blackwood took the stand with practiced ease, describing how he had been simply trying to take photographs near the palace when Morrison had suddenly become aggressive and threatening. "I was genuinely afraid for my safety," Blackwood testified, his voice carrying just the right amount of emotion. "This soldier became hostile without any provocation whatsoever. I'm a law-abiding citizen who was simply exercising my right to visit public areas around the palace." Morrison's appointed defense counsel seemed overwhelmed, clearly expecting this to be a routine case with a predetermined outcome. The evidence appeared straightforward. Morrison had broken protocol by speaking to a civilian while on duty, and there was video evidence of the interaction. Then Colonel Whitfield requested permission to address the tribunal. General Hawthorne, who had been briefed on the colonel's investigation, granted the request with keen interest. The atmosphere in the room shifted as the decorated veteran stood to speak. "General Hawthorne, distinguished officers of this tribunal," Colonel Whitfield began, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of service. "I submit that this case is not about one soldier's momentary lapse in judgment, but about a calculated attack on the integrity of our entire military system." Blackwood's confident expression faltered slightly as the colonel continued. "Mr. Blackwood is not the innocent victim he claims to be. He is a predator who has systematically targeted and destroyed the careers of at least 4 other soldiers over the past 5 years." The colonel presented his evidence methodically. First came the testimony of Sergeant David Chen, a former ceremonial guard whose career had been destroyed 3 years earlier after a similar incident with Blackwood. Chen described how Blackwood had spent over an hour making increasingly provocative comments before finally provoking him into a response. "He knew exactly what he was doing," Chen testified via video link. "He kept pushing and pushing until I finally told him to show some respect. Then suddenly, he was the victim, claiming I had threatened him. I lost my career, my pension, and my reputation because of that man." Next came Corporal Michael Thompson, another victim whose story was nearly identical to Morrison's. Thompson had been on duty at a different military installation when Blackwood had targeted him with the same tactics. The pattern was unmistakable: deliberate provocation, followed by claims of victimization. Blackwood's lawyer attempted to object, but Colonel Whitfield was just getting started. He presented evidence that Blackwood owned a private security company that had hired 3 of the soldiers whose careers he had destroyed. The twisted business model became clear. Blackwood would target promising military personnel, destroy their careers, then offer them employment at reduced wages. "This man has turned the honor and discipline of our soldiers into his personal profit center," Whitfield declared. "He specifically targets young servicemen because he knows they will not strike back physically. But he also knows that dedicated soldiers have a breaking point when faced with attacks on everything they hold sacred." The most damning evidence came from security footage that Blackwood's lawyers had suppressed in previous cases. The video clearly showed Blackwood's aggressive and provocative behavior, including his deliberate attempts to goad soldiers into responding. In one particularly disturbing clip, Blackwood could be heard laughing with his assistant about how easy it was to break young soldiers. General Hawthorne's expression grew increasingly stern as she reviewed the evidence. "Mr. Blackwood, do you wish to respond to these allegations?" Blackwood, no longer confident, attempted to maintain his innocence. "These are all lies and fabrications. I am the victim here, not these soldiers who can't control their tempers." Colonel Whitfield then called his final witness, Inspector Sarah Mills from the Metropolitan Police. Inspector Mills testified that her department had been investigating Blackwood's company for potential fraud and had discovered evidence of his systematic targeting of military personnel. Mr. Blackwood's behavior constitutes a pattern of deliberate provocation designed to create legal and professional difficulties for military personnel, Inspector Mills stated. "Our investigation has revealed that this is not coincidental but rather a calculated business strategy." The tribunal recessed for deliberation, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. When they reconvened, General Hawthorne delivered their verdict with military precision. "Private Morrison, this tribunal finds that while you did technically break protocol, you did so under extraordinary provocation designed specifically to achieve that result. The charges against you are hereby dismissed, and you are restored to full duty with no disciplinary action noted in your record." Morrison's relief was visible as tears welled in his eyes. His military career, which had seemed over just days before, was restored in a single moment. General Hawthorne then turned her attention to Blackwood. "Mr. Blackwood, based on the evidence presented today, this tribunal recommends that criminal charges be filed against you for fraud, harassment, and conspiracy. You are hereby banned from all military installations and ceremonial areas. Security personnel have been instructed to remove you immediately if you attempt to approach any military personnel on duty." As military police escorted Blackwood from the tribunal room, he shouted threats about lawsuits and political connections. But his power had been broken by the simple act of exposing the truth about his predatory behavior. Colonel Whitfield approached Morrison after the hearing. "Son, this was never about you. This was about protecting every soldier who might face this predator in the future. You maintained your honor under impossible circumstances, and that's what real military service looks like." In the months that followed, 3 of the soldiers whose careers had been destroyed by Blackwood were offered the opportunity to return to service with full restoration of their records. A parliamentary inquiry was launched into how Blackwood had been allowed to operate for so long without oversight. Morrison returned to his duties at Buckingham Palace with a new understanding of the support system that surrounded him. His fellow guards treated him as a hero who had exposed a threat to their entire community. The incident that had nearly destroyed his career became instead a testament to the military's commitment to protecting its own. Colonel Whitfield was commended for his investigation and received official recognition for his role in exposing Blackwood's scheme. More importantly to him, he had upheld the military values of loyalty, honor, and protecting those who serve. Richard Blackwood's security company collapsed within weeks of the tribunal. Several former employees came forward with additional evidence of his fraudulent practices. He was eventually convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to prison, his days of destroying military careers finally at an end. Private Morrison continued his service with distinction, eventually earning promotion and becoming a mentor to younger guards. He never forgot the lesson that sometimes justice requires someone with the courage to dig deeper and fight for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. The case became a landmark example within military justice circles, demonstrating that the system could still protect honorable soldiers from those who would exploit their dedication and integrity. Colonel Whitfield's intervention had not only saved one young soldier's career, but had exposed a predator and protected countless others who might have become future victims. Years later, Morrison would often reflect on that moment when his career hung in the balance and wonder what would have happened if Colonel Whitfield had not chosen to investigate further. The answer, he knew, was that justice sometimes requires extraordinary individuals willing to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves.